Let this be a warning. The greatest storms reveal the truest hearts. In the eye of a hurricane, a simple act of kindness, shelter given to 3 desperate strangers will echo with unforeseen consequences. Is a story of sacrifice and the quiet power of compassion. Prepare to discover how the smallest light can illuminate the darkest of secrets and change a life forever. What you're about to hear today might change the way you see things. But first, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the ending. The bell above the diner's door chimed a single, lonely note, a sound swallowed almost instantly by the blizzard's howl. Susan reached out and flipped the plastic sign hanging on the glass from open to closed. The letters, a faded, sun-bleached red, seemed to mock her. Closed. It was only 4:30 p.m. Her reflection in the dark window was a ghost superimposed over the swirling white chaos outside. A woman in her late 40s with hair the color of dishwater pulled back into a haphazard bun, and lines around her eyes that hadn't been there 5 years ago. She wore a simple, long-sleeved thermal shirt and jeans, a thick apron tied around her waist, its once cheerful gingham pattern now stained with the ghosts of 1,000 meals. This was her kingdom, her albatross, the Crossroads Diner, a name that had once felt hopeful, a promise of travelers and stories and steady business. Tonight it just felt literal, a place stuck between a failing past and a future she couldn't afford to see. The diner was a relic, a long, narrow rectangle of chrome, red vinyl, and formica. A counter with 12 stools ran the length of the room, and 6 booths with patched-up seats lined the opposite wall. The air smelled of old coffee, fried onions, and the faint metallic tang of the storm seeping through the doorframe. The only sounds were the relentless hiss of the wind, the thump-thump-thump of the wiper on Hank's plow truck across the street, and the low grumble of the industrial fridge in the kitchen. Silence had a weight here, and today it was crushing. Her goal was simple, a mantra she'd repeated to herself for the last 18 months. Keep the doors open. Just keep the doors open. It was a goal that felt more impossible with each passing day, each unpaid invoice, each silent phone call from the bank. Today's objective had been to make enough to cover the propane delivery scheduled for tomorrow. She'd needed 10 customers, just 10. She'd had one. Old man Hemlock, who came in at 7 a.m. for his usual 2 eggs over easy and black coffee, and who paid with exact change, leaving a single worn dollar bill as a tip. Now, with the storm slamming shut the day, that goal was as buried as the road out front. She moved through the empty diner, her sneakers squeaking on the checkerboard linoleum. Her actions were automatic. A tired ballet performed for an absent audience. She emptied the Bun-O-Matic, the dark, gritty grounds hitting the trash with a soft thud. She wiped down the already spotless counter, her cloth moving in slow circular motions. Each task was a postponement, a way to avoid the ledger. The obstacle wasn't just the storm. The storm was merely the latest, most visible symptom of a deeper sickness. The new interstate, completed 2 years ago, had siphoned off the lifeblood of her business. The truckers, the families on road trips, the salesmen moving between counties. The stack of bills in the locked drawer under the register was the real blizzard. The mortgage on the building, the loan she'd taken out to replace the roof after the hailstorm, the creeping, insidious cost of groceries. She was being slowly, politely suffocated by paper. Finally, with the chores done, she could delay no longer. She retrieved the small black ledger from the drawer. The cover was worn soft at the edges. Sitting on the last stool at the counter, the one with the best view of the street, she opened it. The numbers on the page were a stark, brutal geography of her failure. The red ink seemed to pulse, a hemorrhage of debt. Her stomach tightened, a familiar cold knot of anxiety. She did the math for the 3rd time that week, as if the numbers might have magically changed. They hadn't. 1 more month, she thought, the words a hollow echo in her mind. Maybe 2 if I skipped the insurance payment. Again. The thought of calling her son, Mark, in Seattle and asking for help sent a fresh wave of shame through her. He had his own life, his new job, his future. She couldn't burden him with this. This diner was her dream, her late husband Frank's dream. Letting it fail felt like betraying him twice over. First by outliving him and then by losing the last tangible piece of their life together. A sudden, ferocious gust of wind shook the entire building, making the window frames rattle in their casings. The lights flickered, dimmed for a heart-stopping second, and then surged back to their full fluorescent glare. Susan's head snapped up, her pen clattering to the counter. Her heart hammered against her ribs. A power outage now would be a catastrophe. The pipes would freeze. The food in the freezers would spoil. It would be the final unpayable bill. Her reaction was pure, undiluted fear. She stood up, her chair scraping loudly in the silence, and hurried to the front window, peering out as if she could somehow gauge the stability of the electrical grid by the intensity of the snow. The world outside was a monochrome fury. Hank's plow was gone, leaving the street a pristine, impassable white desert. They were alone, the diner and her, a tiny island in a frozen sea. The action of the storm, its direct threat to her fragile existence, broke her paralysis. She couldn't control the economy or the new highway, but she could fight this. She could stoke the furnace. She could get the generator ready just in case. This was a tangible enemy. She was heading towards the back, towards the basement door and the grumbling oil furnace, when a different sound cut through the storm's roar. It wasn't the wind. It was a deep, guttural groaning of an engine, straining and protesting, and then the unmistakable, sickening crunch of metal meeting something immovable. Susan froze, her hand on the cool metal of the pass-through to the kitchen. The sound had come from the front, from the road just beyond her parking lot. Her first emotion was a flicker of irrational hope. A customer? But it was immediately extinguished by a cold dread. That was the sound of an accident. She rushed back to the window, cupping her hands around her eyes to block out the interior reflection. It was nearly dark now, the premature night of the blizzard, but her security light, a lone yellow beacon on a tall pole, cast a wobbly cone of illumination over the parking lot and the stretch of road beyond. There, angled crazily into the ditch at the edge of her lot, was a dark blue pickup truck. Its front end was buried in the snowbank, and the driver's side door was wedged against the trunk of a large oak tree. The engine had stalled, and in the sudden quiet between gusts of wind, the silence was more terrifying than the crash itself. Her immediate, ingrained instinct was to help. This was what you did. You saw trouble, you went. But a smaller, more cautious voice, honed by years of running a business and living alone, whispered warnings. Who is it? What if they're dangerous? Your liability? The internal conflict was brief but sharp. The sight of the vehicle, already being encased by the driving snow, decided it. This wasn't about business or liability. This was about basic humanity. Someone was in trouble at her doorstep. She grabbed her heavy, down-filled coat from the hook by the door, shoved her feet into a pair of sturdy boots, and wrapped a thick wool scarf around her head and neck. Taking a deep breath, she unbolted the door and pushed. The wind fought her for a moment, then snatched the door from her grasp, slamming it back against the wall with a bang that was lost in the gale. The cold was a physical assault. It stole her breath and needled its way through her coat instantly. The snow, fine and sharp as glass dust, stung her exposed cheeks. She leaned into the wind, trudging through the knee-deep drifts that had already accumulated in her parking lot. The world had shrunk to this small circle of yellow light and the groaning of the ancient oak tree branches above. As she neared the truck, she could see the driver, a man, his head resting against the steering wheel. The windshield on his side was a spiderweb of cracks emanating from a point where his head had likely struck the glass. A trickle of dark blood, stark against his pale skin, ran from his temple down his cheek. "Hey!" Susan yelled, her voice thin and whipped away by the wind. She rapped her knuckles on the passenger side window, which was fogged from his breath. "Hey, are you okay?" The man stirred slowly, groggily. He lifted his head and his eyes, wide and disoriented, met hers through the glass. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe late 20s, with dark hair and a sharp, angular jaw now slack with confusion and pain. He fumbled for the door handle, and after a moment the passenger door swung open towards her. "Lady, I hit a patch of ice," he slurred, his words thick. "I couldn't see a thing." "Can you move?" Susan asked, her voice firm, slipping into the capable take-charge mode she used with drunk patrons or distressed customers. "Are you hurt anywhere else?" My head. Just my head." He tried to shift to climb out and winced, his hand flying to his ribs. "Okay, maybe my side too." "Easy now, easy." She offered her arm, and he took it, his grip surprisingly strong even in his dazed state. He was a big man, tall and solidly built, and leaning on her he felt like a felled tree. Together, they half-walked, half-stumbled through the blizzard back towards the glowing sanctuary of the diner. Every step was a battle against the wind and the clinging snow. Susan's heart was pounding, a mix of exertion and a rising, nameless anxiety. She got him inside, the warmth of the diner hitting them like a physical wall after the brutal cold. She helped him onto the same stool at the counter where she'd been sitting with her ledger just minutes before. He slumped forward, his elbows on the formica, and she quickly bolted the door shut again, sealing out the storm. "Let me get a look at you," she said, her tone all business, masking the turmoil inside. She fetched the small first aid kit from under the counter and a clean, damp cloth from the kitchen. He was more alert now, his dark eyes taking in the diner with a swift, assessing glance that seemed too sharp for someone who had just been in an accident. He winced as she gently dabbed the cut on his temple. It wasn't deep, but head wounds always bled profusely. "Thank you," he said, his voice clearer now. "I didn't think anyone was open. Saw your light. Thought I was seeing things." "Lucky for you I was still here," Susan said, applying a butterfly bandage. Her fingers were steady, but her mind was racing. "Lucky for him. But what about for me? What's your name?" "Leo," he said after a beat of hesitation so brief she almost missed it. "Leo Walsh. I'm Susan. This is my place." She finished with the bandage and took a step back, crossing her arms. "You said you hit ice. Where were you headed in this mess?" "North. Towards Burlington," he said. But his eyes darted away from hers, focusing on the pie display case. Visiting family. It was a lie. She felt it in her bones, a cold certainty that had nothing to do with the weather outside. The road to Burlington had been closed since noon. The state police had put out the alert on the local AM station. And his truck? When she'd helped him out, she'd seen the New York plates, caked with mud and snow, but visible. Burlington was south. He was heading north. A fresh wave of fear, different from the financial anxiety, washed over her. It was a primal, sharp fear. She was alone in a locked diner, in the middle of a blizzard that had isolated them completely, with a man who was lying to her. She forced a smile, the muscles in her face feeling stiff and unnatural. "Well, Leo, you're not going anywhere tonight. The roads are impassable. The plows won't be through until morning, if then." She moved behind the counter, putting its solid width between them. Her eyes fell on the cast-iron skillet hanging on the kitchen wall just within reach. A ridiculous, melodramatic thought, but it was a comfort. "I'll make some coffee," she said, her voice a little too bright. "Strong and hot. It's the least I can do." As she turned to fill the carafe at the sink, her back to him, the silence in the diner stretched, thick and heavy. The only sounds were the water running, the wind screaming, and the frantic beating of her own heart. She could feel his gaze on her back, a tangible pressure. Then he spoke, his voice low and calm, cutting through the ambient noise with chilling clarity. "You know, Susan," Leo said, "it really was lucky I saw your light. A place like this, all alone out here, a person could hide just about anything and no one would ever know." Susan's hand, holding the full carafe, froze in midair. The water sloshed gently inside. She didn't dare turn around. She didn't dare breathe. The hum of the fluorescent light seemed to grow louder, a high-pitched whine in her ears. Slowly, very slowly, she placed the carafe on the counter and turned to face him. Leo was no longer slumping. He was sitting up straight, his shoulders squared. The dazed, pained expression was gone from his face, replaced by a calm, unnerving intensity. His dark eyes were fixed on her, and in their depths she saw no gratitude, no confusion. She saw only a cold, calculating focus. He smiled, a thin, humorless stretching of his lips that didn't reach his eyes. "So," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was somehow more terrifying than a shout. "Why don't you tell me what you're really doing out here all by yourself?" The silence that followed Leo's question was a physical entity, thick and suffocating. It was broken only by the frantic, percussive thumping of Susan's heart against her ribs. The fluorescent lights hummed their indifferent, high-pitched song. She could feel the weight of his gaze, a laser of cold intent drilling into her back. Slowly, with a deliberate control she did not feel, Susan placed the glass carafe back on the counter. The clink it made was unnaturally loud. She turned to face him, her movements stiff, her mind screaming at her to run, to fight, to do something. But she was trapped. The storm was her jailer, and this man, Leo, was her new, terrifying cellmate. Her eyes flickered towards the cast-iron skillet, a dark shape on the kitchen wall. It seemed a mile away. "What I'm doing here," she repeated, her voice a dry rasp. She forced a laugh, a hollow, brittle sound. "I'm trying to survive a blizzard. Same as you." She gestured vaguely around the empty diner. "This is my life." "Not much to tell." Leo's thin smile didn't waver. He leaned forward slightly, his large hands splayed on the formica counter. The butterfly bandage on his temple was a stark white flag against his skin. A life all the way out here, so isolated. A person would have to be very brave, or have something to hide. A fresh, icy dread trickled down Susan's spine. This wasn't random. His words were too pointed, too specific. He wasn't just a stranded motorist. He was here for a reason. Her reason? The ledger, the debt, the desperate, silent prayers she'd sent out into the universe. Had they been answered by a demon? Before she could form a response, a new sound tore through the diner's fragile bubble of tension. It wasn't the wind. It was a pounding. A heavy, frantic fist hammering against the diner's front door. Bam, bam, bam. Both Susan and Leo jerked their heads towards the noise. Susan's breath caught in her throat. Through the snow-plastered glass, she could make out 3 dark, hulking shapes pressed against the door. They were large, indistinct figures shrouded in the swirling white. Leo's reaction was instantaneous and unsettling. The calm, menacing intensity vanished, replaced by a flicker of something that looked like panic. He slid off the stool. His movements suddenly fluid and predatory, and backed away from the counter, his eyes fixed on the door. "Don't answer it," he commanded, his voice low and sharp. The pounding came again, more insistent this time. A muffled voice shredded by the gale fought its way inside. "Hello, please." "We're freezing out here." Susan stood frozen, a statue of conflicting terrors. On one side was Leo, a known, calculating threat. On the other, an unknown one. 3 large men beating down her door in the middle of a blizzard. Her mind raced through a catalog of fears. Were they with him? Were they more of them? Or were they just more victims of the storm, desperate and dying? Her goal, which had moments ago been simply to survive the encounter with Leo, now fractured into a more primal, immediate need. Assess this new threat and prevent her sanctuary from being violently breached. The obstacle was the sheer paralyzing uncertainty. Trusting anyone felt like a fatal mistake. "We see the light. Please just let us in for a minute," another voice yelled, higher-pitched, laced with a genuine desperation that the storm couldn't disguise. That note of raw plea cut through Susan's fear. It was the same instinct that had sent her out into the storm for Leo. This was her place. She helped people. It was who she was, even when it was foolish, even when it was dangerous. It was the last shred of her identity that the failing business hadn't been able to strip away. "I have to," she said to Leo, her voice firming with a resolve that surprised her. "They'll die out there." Leo took a step towards her, his eyes wide. "You don't know who they are." "I don't know who you are," she shot back, the words escaping before she could stop them. The truth of that statement hung in the air between them. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing, his gaze darting back to the door as the pounding started anew. Susan moved. Her legs felt like wood, but she forced them to carry her across the checkerboard floor. She could feel Leo's eyes on her, a hot brand between her shoulder blades. As she approached the door, she saw them more clearly. 3 men coated in a thick crust of ice and snow, their faces raw and red from the cold. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with a thick ice-flecked beard, saw her and pressed his face to the glass, his eyes wide with a mixture of hope and exhaustion. "Please, ma'am," he mouthed, the words barely audible. Her internal conflict was a war waged in the space of a single heartbeat. Fear screamed at her to turn away, to bolt the door tighter, to hide with the devil she knew. But her conscience, that stubborn, inconvenient moral compass, won out. What if it was Mark out there? The thought was a gut punch. She couldn't live with herself if she left them to freeze. With a final trembling breath, she unbolted the top lock, then the bottom. Leo made a small, strangled sound behind her, but he didn't move to stop her. She pulled the door open and the storm exploded into the diner. Wind, snow, and a bitter cold that stole the air from her lungs rushed in. The 3 men practically fell inside, stumbling over the threshold and collapsing onto the linoleum in a heap of sopping winter gear and shuddering limbs. "Oh, God. Thank you. Thank you." The bearded man gasped, his voice a ragged sob of relief. He was the oldest of the 3, maybe in his early 50s, with a rugged, weathered face that spoke of outdoor labor. The second man was younger, lanky, with a shock of red hair plastered to his forehead. He just lay on the floor for a moment, chest heaving, his eyes closed. The third was a large, quiet man with a gentle face, who immediately began trying to help the others up, his own hands shaking uncontrollably. Susan quickly shoved the door closed, fighting against the wind once more, and threw the bolts. The sudden return to relative quiet was jarring. The only sounds were the men's ragged breathing, the howl of the banished storm, and the drip, drip, drip of melting snow from their coats forming ever-widening puddles on her clean floor. Her immediate reaction was a surge of pragmatic energy. The threat assessment was momentarily set aside for triage. They were half frozen, not hostile. "Get those wet coats off. Come on, over by the heater," she instructed, her voice taking on the no-nonsense tone she used in a crisis. She gestured to the old radiator that ran along the wall beneath the booths, which was now clanking furiously as it fought the invasive cold. The men complied, shuffling weakly towards the heat source, shedding their heavy, soaked parkas and gloves. They left a trail of water and slush in their wake. It was only then that Susan remembered Leo. She turned, her body tensing for, what, a confrontation? An attack? He was standing exactly where she'd left him, but his posture had changed again. The panic was gone, replaced by a watchful, guarded stillness. He had retreated into a shadowy corner near the end of the counter, making himself less conspicuous. His eyes, however, were constantly moving, flicking from the 3 new arrivals to the doors to the windows to Susan. He was assessing, calculating, a predator sizing up a new herd. The bearded man, who seemed to be the de facto leader, noticed Leo first. He nodded a cautious, weary gesture. "Rough night to be on the road," he said, his voice still rough from the cold. Leo gave a curt single nod in return. "That it is." "I'm Joe," the bearded man said, extending a still trembling hand towards Susan. "This is Kyle," he pointed to the redhead, who managed a weak wave, and Ben. The large, quiet man nodded solemnly. "Our van slid into a ditch about a mile back. We were trying to walk for help. Saw your light. Thought we were done for." "Susan," she replied, shaking his cold hand briefly. "This is the Crossroads Diner. You're welcome to wait out the storm here." She was acutely aware of how formal she sounded, how the words echoed the sentiment on her open sign, a hollow formality under the circumstances. Her goal had now shifted, expanded. It was no longer just about surviving Leo. It was about managing this volatile new dynamic. 4 strangers, 4 men, in her diner. Her kingdom had been invaded, and she was hopelessly outnumbered. The fragile control she'd wielded over her own life was gone, replaced by the terrifying law of the jungle. "We can't thank you enough, ma'am," Joe said, his gratitude seeming genuine. He rubbed his hands together vigorously in front of the radiator. "We're road crew for the county. We were out trying to clear a downed tree when the whiteout hit, lost the plow, then the van." The obstacle to Susan's desire for control and safety was now multifaceted. There was Leo, an enigmatic and clearly dangerous variable. There were these 3 new men whose story seemed plausible but was unverified. And there was the sheer, overwhelming numerical disadvantage. She was 1 woman. They were 4 men. The math was simple and terrifying. Her reaction was to fall back on the rituals of hospitality. It was her only weapon, her only semblance of normalcy. "Let me get you some coffee. Something hot," she said, moving back behind the relative safety of the counter. The action put a physical barrier between her and the 4 of them. As she busied herself with the coffee maker, her hands trembled so badly she sloshed water onto the counter. She could feel the tension in the room, a complex web of unspoken questions and suspicions. The 3 road crewmen were too exhausted to pay Leo much mind, but he was studying them with an unnerving intensity. He hadn't moved from his corner, a silent, brooding sentinel. "You folks from around here?" Joe asked, directing the question to the room at large, but his eyes settled on Leo, the outlier. "Just passing through," Leo said, his voice neutral. "Got caught like everyone else." "Bad luck," Joe said, and took the mug of coffee Susan offered him with another grateful nod. "But good luck finding this place." He took a long, slow sip, his eyes closing in momentary bliss. When he opened them, he looked at Susan. "You here all alone, Susan?" The question hung in the air, loaded and dangerous. Susan's blood ran cold. She saw Leo's posture stiffen almost imperceptibly. This was it, the moment the balance of power could shift irrevocably. If she said yes, she confirmed her vulnerability to all of them. If she lied and they found out, it could shatter any fragile trust. She forced another smile, a tight, nervous thing. "Just me and the coffee machine tonight," she said, her voice thankfully steady. It wasn't a direct answer, but it was the best she could do. She served Kyle and Ben their coffee. Ben, the quiet one, took his with a soft, "Thank you, ma'am," his eyes kind. Kyle just gulped his down, his gaze darting around the diner with a nervous energy that mirrored her own. For a few minutes, a fragile, exhausted peace settled over the diner. The only sounds were the sipping of coffee, the hiss of the radiator, and the relentless symphony of the blizzard outside. Susan stayed behind the counter, her mind racing, trying to plan, to find an advantage. The ledger, with its damning red numbers, felt like a relic from a different, simpler life. Survival had become a much more immediate currency. It was Kyle who broke the silence. He had been fidgeting with his phone, scowling at the no-service icon. He looked up, his eyes landing on the old wall-mounted phone next to the cash register. "Hey, does that phone work?" he asked, a note of sudden hope in his voice. "I gotta call my wife. She'll be freaking out." Susan's heart sank. The phone. She'd forgotten about the phone. It was her only lifeline, a tenuous thread to the outside world, but it was also a catalyst. "The lines might be down," she said quickly, too quickly. "The storm." But Joe was already nodding. "Worth a try, son." He looked at Susan expectantly. The obstacle was now tangible. Letting them use the phone felt like surrendering her last bit of control, inviting the outside world into this pressurized capsule. What if Leo didn't want that? What would he do to stop it? Her eyes flicked to Leo. He was watching the exchange, his expression unreadable, but his body was coiled tight. "Of course," Susan said, the words tasting like ash. She gestured weakly towards the phone. "It's a landline. Should be fine if the lines are up." Kyle was already moving, crossing the diner with a new purpose. He picked up the heavy beige receiver and put it to his ear. A beat, a frown. He jiggled the cradle. "Hello? Hello?" He tapped the hang-up button several times, the click-click-click unnaturally loud in the tense silence. He turned to face the room, his face a mask of confusion and dawning alarm. "It's dead," he said. "The line's completely dead." A cold that had nothing to do with the storm seeped into Susan's bones. She knew the phone had been working just a few hours ago. She'd called the propane company to confirm the delivery. Her eyes, against her will, were drawn to Leo. He hadn't moved, but in the dim light of the corner she saw the faintest ghost of a smile touch his lips. It was there and gone in an instant, but she saw it, a smile of satisfaction. And in that moment Susan knew with a chilling, absolute certainty. The dead phone line wasn't the storm's doing. It was his. The silence in the diner was no longer merely empty. It was charged, a taut wire thrumming with unspoken threats. The click-click-click of the dead phone's cradle was the only sound, a metronome counting down to some unseen disaster. Kyle's face, pale and bewildered, turned from the phone to the rest of them, his hope visibly curdling into fear. "It's dead," he repeated, his voice hollow. "The line's completely dead." Susan's gaze was locked on Leo. That fleeting, spectral smile had vanished, but its ghost lingered in the cold calculation of his eyes. He met her look for a fraction of a second, and in that exchange a terrifying understanding passed between them. He had done this. How she didn't know, cut the line outside, disabled the junction box, but the certainty was a stone in her gut. The storm had provided the perfect cover for sabotage, isolating them as effectively as a prison. Her immediate goal, which had been a frantic, scattered thing, survive Leo, manage the newcomers, crystallized into something sharp and desperate. Maintain the illusion of control. Do not let them see your fear. The diner was her stage, and she had to perform the role of the unshakable proprietor, the calm center in the chaos. If that illusion shattered, the delicate, dangerous balance in the room would shatter with it. The obstacle was her own pounding heart. The tremor in her hands she hid by clasping them tightly behind her back. It was the 4 pairs of male eyes watching, waiting for her next move. "The storm must have taken the lines down," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, a minor miracle. She forced a pragmatic sigh. "Happens more often than you'd think out here." The weight of the ice on the cables. It was a lie, a flimsy one, but it was the only script she had. Joe, the bearded road crew leader, rubbed a hand over his face. "Damn, Marta's gonna be worried sick." He looked at Susan, his exhaustion making him seem older than his years. "I'm sorry to impose further, ma'am, but is there any chance? I don't suppose you have a cell signal booster? Or a radio?" "Nothing," Susan said, shaking her head with genuine regret this time. "We're in a dead zone on a good day. With this," she gestured to the white fury outside the windows, "we're on our own until it passes." A collective gloom seemed to settle over the three road crewmen. Ben, the large quiet one, simply bowed his head. Kyle slumped against the wall, resuming his frantic tapping on his useless smartphone. Joe nodded slowly, accepting the grim reality. Leo, however, remained in his shadowy corner, a statue of observation. He hadn't commented on the phone, hadn't moved to check his own device. He was a black hole, absorbing all the anxiety in the room and giving nothing back. This new enforced isolation presented Susan with her next critical decision. The ancient furnace in the basement grumbled, a reminder that they had heat for now, but they also needed food, water, and light if the power failed. Her resources, like her bank account, were finite. The industrial freezer in the back was stocked with the week's supplies: burgers, fries, frozen vegetables, a few steaks for the weekend crowd that never came. In the dry goods pantry were cans of soup, beans, coffee, and flour. It was meant to last her a month. Now it had to last 5 people for an unknown duration. Her instinct, the one bred from a lifetime of hospitality, was to offer what she had, to make a pot of chili, to brew more coffee, to be the sanctuary she had always promised this place to be. But a new, harder voice, forged in the fires of financial ruin and now fanned by Leo's presence, argued against it. These are strangers. He is a threat. Every can you open is money you don't have. Every blanket you give out is a liability. Protect what's yours. It's all you have left. The internal conflict was a physical ache in her chest. It was the battle between the woman she had been and the woman she was being forced to become. "You boys must be starving," she finally said, the words feeling like a surrender to her better nature, or perhaps a strategic move to foster goodwill. "I can't offer much, but I can make some grilled cheese and heat up a can of tomato soup." The effect on the 3 men was immediate and profound. Kyle's head snapped up, his eyes wide with a pathetic gratitude that shamed Susan for her earlier hesitation. Ben looked up, a small, genuine smile softening his broad features. Joe's shoulders, which had been hunched with worry, relaxed a fraction. "Ma'am, we'd be mighty grateful," Joe said, his voice thick with emotion. "We can pay you, of course, once." Susan waved a hand, cutting him off. "Don't worry about it. It's just sandwiches." The lie came easily this time. She was worrying about it plenty. As she moved behind the counter towards the kitchen pass-through, she was hyper-aware of Leo. He hadn't reacted to the offer of food. He just watched her, a predator observing the habits of its prey. "What about you, Leo?" she asked, pausing at the swing door. "Are you hungry?" It was a test, a probe to see how he would integrate or if he would remain apart. His dark eyes held hers. "I'm fine," he said, his voice flat. "Thank you." She just nodded and pushed through into the kitchen, the double doors swinging shut behind her. The kitchen was her sanctuary, a familiar landscape of stainless steel and worn enamel. For the first time since the pounding had started on the door, she felt a sliver of control. Here she was the general. She lit the gas grill with a familiar whoosh, the blue flames a comforting elemental force. She pulled a block of government cheese and a loaf of cheap white bread from the fridge, and a large can of condensed tomato soup from the pantry. The actions were rote, meditative. Slice the cheese. Butter the bread. Get the soup pot from the hook. But her mind was whirring, plotting trajectories from the grill to the cast iron skillet on the wall. 3 steps. She could reach it in 2 seconds if she had to. The savory smell of toasting bread and melting cheese soon seeped into the diner, a mundane aroma that felt like a rebellion against the circumstances. It was the smell of normalcy, of safety, and she hoped it would act as a pacifying agent on the volatile atmosphere in the next room. When she carried the tray out, 4 plates of golden brown sandwiches and a large tureen of steaming soup, the scene had shifted subtly. The 3 road crewmen were now seated in one of the patched vinyl booths, huddled over the table as if for warmth and comfort. Leo, however, had not joined them. He had moved to the far end of the counter, 2 stools down from where he'd been sitting before, maintaining his distance but altering his angle to better observe both the booth and the kitchen door. Susan served the 3 men first, placing the food before them. Their thanks were profuse and heartfelt. "You're an angel, Susan," Joe said, and the sincerity in his voice made her throat tighten. She then placed a single plate and a bowl of soup on the counter in front of Leo's new spot. He looked at it, then up at her, a question in his eyes. "Eat," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "You'll need your strength if we have to dig out in the morning." It was a logical, practical reason, masking her true motive, to see if he would accept her authority, however small, in this domain. For a long moment he just stared at the food. Then with a slow, deliberate movement he picked up the sandwich. "Thank you," he said, his voice low. It was a small victory, but it felt significant. She had forced a connection, however fragile. She retreated behind the counter, not eating herself, her own stomach a tangled knot of nerves. She watched as the three men in the booth ate with the focused intensity of the truly hungry, and as Leo ate his sandwich with a strange, mechanical precision, as if performing a necessary but distasteful task. The food, as she had hoped, eased the tension. The men began to talk in low murmurs about the storm, about the downed tree, about their families. The conversation was a low hum beneath the storm's roar, a sound of life that made the diner feel less like a tomb. But the reprieve was short-lived. As they finished eating, the reality of their situation began to sink in again. The wind redoubled its efforts, shaking the building with a fresh wave of fury. The lights flickered again, this time dipping low and staying there for 3 long, heart-stopping seconds before surging back to full brightness. "That's not good," Kyle muttered, his eyes wide. "The power's gonna go," Joe said, stating the grim probability they were all thinking. "If it does, how long will the heat last?" All eyes turned to Susan. This was her domain, her knowledge. Her goal was now one of pure survival logistics. She had to manage their expectations, their fears, and the dwindling resources, all while keeping a watchful eye on Leo. "The furnace is oil," she explained, slipping back into her capable mode. "It needs electricity for the blower and the ignition. If the power goes out, the heat goes out." She saw the despair dawn on their faces and quickly added, "But I have a generator. It's old, but it works. It can power the furnace blower, the fridge, and a few lights for a few hours if we're careful with the fuel." "How much fuel do you have?" Leo asked, his first voluntary contribution to the group's welfare. His voice was neutral, but the question was sharp, practical. "About 10 gallons in the shed out back," Susan said. "Enough for a day, maybe 2 if we cycle it on and off." It was another lie, an inflation of her actual reserves. She had 5 gallons. Maybe. "We should get it now," Joe said, already starting to rise. "Before the drifts get any higher. Me and the boys can help you bring it in, get it set up." This was the moment Susan had been dreading, going outside into the blinding, violent dark, with 3 men she barely trusted, while leaving her diner and all her vulnerabilities, the ledger, the cash box alone with Leo. It was an impossible choice. The obstacle was her profound gut-level distrust. Of them, of him, of the entire situation. "The shed's lock is probably frozen solid," she said, stalling. "And the generator is heavy. It's a 2-person job at best. Ben here could lift a car if he had to," Joe said, clapping the large man on the shoulder. Ben gave a modest, shy smile. "We're here. We're able. Let us help." Susan's eyes flicked to Leo. He was watching the exchange with keen interest, his head tilted slightly. He gave a barely perceptible shake of his head. A warning. Or was it a command? Her reaction was a surge of defiance. She would not be trapped by this man's unspoken rules. Allying with the road crew, however risky, was her only play. It was the only way to counter the threat he posed. "All right," she said, her decision made. "Joe, you and Ben come with me. Kyle, you stay here and keep an eye on things." She hoped the message was clear. Watch him. She grabbed her coat and boots again, her movements brisk with newfound purpose. Joe and Ben suited up as well, their large frames making the diner seem suddenly small. As she zipped her coat, she caught Leo's eye. He was no longer shaking his head. He was just looking at her, his expression unreadable, a dark pool of calm in the frantic energy of the room. The 3 of them pushed out into the maelstrom. The cold was even more brutal than before, if that was possible. The wind screamed, tearing the breath from their lungs. The security light was just a dim, swaying smudge in the swirling white. "This way," Susan yelled, her voice a mere whisper against the gale. She led them around the side of the building, the snowdrifts now reaching past her knees, each step an exhausting battle. The small aluminum shed was at the back, nearly buried already. As Joe and Ben started digging at the drift blocking the door with their hands, Susan fought with the padlock. It was, as she'd feared, encased in a shell of ice. She fumbled in her pocket for the key, her fingers numb and clumsy. While they worked, a sliver of hope wormed its way into her heart. These men were helping, They were strong, capable. They seemed decent. Maybe she had been wrong to be so afraid. Maybe together, they could weather the storm and whatever threat Leo represented. After a few minutes of brutal work, the lock gave way with a crack. Joe pulled the shed door open, the metal groaning in protest. Inside, shrouded in cobwebs, sat the hulking red Honda generator. Ben moved in without a word, bending his knees and wrapping his arms around it. With a grunt of effort that was swallowed by the wind, he lifted it and carried it out as if it were a bag of flour. "Let's get it to the back door," Joe shouted, pointing. They stumbled through the snow, Susan leading the way to the diner's rear entrance, which opened directly into the kitchen. It was slower going with the heavy load, but they made it. Susan unlocked the door and held it open, and Ben maneuvered the generator inside, setting it down on the kitchen's linoleum floor with a solid thud. They stood there for a moment in the relative quiet of the kitchen, panting, dripping snow and water onto the floor. The wind howled outside, but they had accomplished their mission. A fragile camaraderie bloomed in the steamy air. "Thank you," Susan said, and she meant it. "I couldn't have done that alone." "It's what neighbors do," Joe said, smiling through his ice-crusted beard. "Even if we're just neighbors for the night." They shed their wet outer layers in the kitchen and walked back out into the diner, a small, triumphant unit. Susan felt a confidence she hadn't felt in hours. They had a plan. They had a generator. The thought died in her head. The diner was exactly as they had left it, and yet completely different. Kyle was still sitting in the booth, but he was rigid, his face pale. Leo was no longer at the counter. He was standing by the front window, his back to them, and in his hand, held loosely, almost casually, was Susan's small black ledger. He must have watched them go out the back, waited a moment, and then retrieved it from its locked drawer. The simple, brutal violation of it stole the air from her lungs. He turned slowly, his calm expression unchanged. He didn't look guilty. He looked informed. "Susan," he said, his voice soft, conversational, yet it cut through the room like a shard of glass. He tapped the cover of the ledger with his finger. "I was just admiring your perseverance. The Crossroads Diner. A lot of history here, and a lot of debt." Joe and Ben had frozen just inside the kitchen doorway, sensing the seismic shift in the atmosphere but not yet understanding it. Leo's eyes, dark and pitiless, fixed on Susan. That cold, calculating focus was back, sharper than ever. "It's a real shame," he continued, taking a slow step towards the center of the room. "All this struggle, this fight to keep the doors open." He paused, letting the weight of his words, of his knowledge, press down on her. "It makes a person vulnerable. It makes them open to propositions." He stopped, standing directly under the diner's main fluorescent light. He smiled that thin, humorless smile again. "So let's stop pretending, Susan. Let's talk about why I'm really here." The silence that followed Leo's declaration was absolute, broken only by the frantic, percussive thumping of Susan's heart against her ribs. He held the ledger, that worn black testament to her failure, as if it were a holy text and he was a priest about to deliver a damning sermon. The air, thick with the smell of tomato soup and wet wool, seemed to crystallize around them. Joe and Ben, still standing by the kitchen door, looked from Leo to Susan, their faces a mixture of confusion and dawning alarm. Kyle had risen slowly from the booth, his earlier nervous energy replaced by a wary stillness. "What's this now?" Joe asked, his voice a low rumble. He took a step forward, his work-booted feet planting firmly on the linoleum. The friendly, grateful road crew leader was gone, replaced by a man sensing a threat to the fragile sanctuary they'd found. Leo ignored him, his dark eyes locked on Susan. "This place is drowning," he said, his tone conversational, almost clinical. He flipped the ledger open with one hand, the pages rustling like dry leaves. "Mortgage arrears, loan payments. You're 3 months behind on the property tax. It's a slow, painful bleed-out." He looked up, his gaze sweeping the diner. "And all this is the corpse." Susan felt a hot flush of shame and fury burn through the cold fear. This private agony, laid bare before these strangers, was a violation worse than any physical threat. Her hands, still numb from the cold outside, clenched into fists at her sides. Her goal, which had fractured and shifted all night, now coalesced into a single sharp point: reclaim control. Shut him down. "That's none of your business," she said, her voice trembling with a rage that surprised her. Put that down." The obstacle was his unnerving calm, the absolute authority with which he held the space. He wasn't a thief in the night. He was an auditor, and she was a failed investment. "It became my business the moment Frank borrowed the money," Leo replied, and the casual mention of her late husband's name was like a physical blow. It stole the air from her lungs. Frank. Her Frank, with his easy laugh and big dreams, who had poured his soul into these chrome and vinyl walls. "What are you talking about?" The question was a whisper, torn from a place deep inside her. "The roof," Leo said, tapping the ledger again. "After the hailstorm. The insurance didn't cover it all. Frank came to us, my employers. He needed $20,000 fast. He offered a private loan." Leo's lips stretched into that thin, humorless smile. The terms were very clear. The diner was the collateral. The world tilted. Susan remembered the desperation of that time. The panic as they discovered the extent of the damage, the sleepless nights. Frank had told her he'd gotten a loan from an old army buddy. He'd been so relieved. She'd never questioned it. She'd been too busy trying to keep the food on the table. "He's been gone for 5 years," Susan said, her voice hollow. "The loan? I never knew." "The payments were deferred out of respect," Leo said, his tone implying the respect had been thin indeed. "But respect has a limit. The principal remains. With interest, it's a significant number now. My job is to collect or to take possession. So this was it. This was the future she couldn't afford to see. Not failure, but foreclosure. Not a slow death, but a violent seizure. The man in the pickup truck wasn't an accident of the storm. He was its embodiment, a force of nature sent to erase her. Joe took another step forward, his presence a solid, grounding force in the room. "Listen, friend," he said, his voice low and steady. The voice of a man used to de-escalating tense situations on the job. "This doesn't sound like a conversation for a blizzard. It sounds like a conversation for a lawyer's office in the daylight." Leo finally shifted his gaze from Susan to Joe. The intensity of it was enough to make the larger man pause. "The storm is the point," Leo said simply. "It provides focus and privacy." His eyes flicked back to Susan. "We can reach an arrangement tonight, a settlement, or I can file the paperwork the moment the plows break through. You'll be out by the end of the month. You have nothing to fight it with." The threat was clear, cold, and utterly credible. The ledger in his hand was the proof. Susan's reaction was a surge of pure, defiant will. This diner was all she had left of Frank, of their life, of the woman she used to be. She would not let this vulture pick its bones clean. She looked from Leo's cold face to the confused but concerned faces of the 3 road crewmen. They were her only leverage, the only variable in his calculated plan. "There's no arrangement to be made," she said, her voice gaining strength. She straightened her spine, pushing back the exhaustion and despair. "That loan wasn't mine. I never signed a thing. You can talk to my lawyer in the morning." She gestured to the ledger. "And you can put my property down now." For the first time, a flicker of something, annoyance, crossed Leo's face. He hadn't expected a fight. He had expected capitulation. "This isn't a request, Susan." "It is from where I'm standing," Joe said, moving to stand beside Susan, a silent show of solidarity. Ben, after a moment's hesitation, moved to her other side, his massive frame a formidable barrier. Kyle remained by the booth, but he was watching Leo with a new, hardened expression. The dynamic had shifted. The herd had chosen its protector. Leo's eyes narrowed. He assessed the 3 men, the set of their jaws, the way they closed ranks around Susan. He was outnumbered. The ledger, his primary weapon, had been deflected. He was still a threat, but the balance of power was no longer his alone. A long, tense moment stretched out, measured by the frantic beating of the wind against the windows. Then with a slow, deliberate movement, Leo closed the ledger and placed it on the counter. It was a concession, but it felt like a tactical retreat, not a surrender. "As you wish," he said, his voice flat. "We'll let the lawyers sort it out." He took a step back, reclaiming his space in the shadowy corner, but the atmosphere in the diner had been permanently altered. The pretense was gone. They were no longer just strangers stranded by a storm. They were adversaries trapped in a cage. Susan's immediate goal had been achieved. She had stood her ground and reclaimed her property. But the larger objective now was survival in a much more complex war. She had to get through the night with a hostile entity in her midst, while maintaining the fragile alliance with the 3 men who had, for reasons of their own decency, sided with her. "The wind's getting worse," Kyle said, breaking the silence. He pointed to one of the front windows where a fine spray of snow was now being forced through a nearly invisible crack in the frame, dusting the red vinyl of the booth beneath it. "That seal's gonna go." It was a distraction, a practical problem they could all focus on, and Susan seized it with both hands. "The storm windows are old," she said, turning her back on Leo, a deliberate act of dismissal. "I have some old towels and duct tape in the closet. We can try to reinforce them." "We'll handle it," Joe said firmly. He gave Susan a look that was both questioning and reassuring. "Are you okay? We've got this." She gave a small, tight nod. For the next hour, the diner was a hive of activity, a tense but purposeful ballet. Joe and Ben moved from window to window, stuffing towels into cracks and sealing them with long strips of silver tape. The ripping sound of the duct tape was a sharp counterpoint to the storm's roar. Kyle found a wobbly leg on one of the booths and used a stack of napkins as a shim to steady it, his earlier nervous energy channeled into useful work. Susan busied herself in the kitchen, making a fresh pot of coffee, her actions automatic. The confrontation had left her shaking, a cocktail of adrenaline and bone-deep weariness. She felt stripped bare, her financial ruin exposed like a raw nerve. But beneath the shame, there was a strange new sensation. She wasn't alone. 3 virtual strangers had stood with her. It was a thin reed of hope. But in the frozen desert of her life, it felt like an oasis. Leo watched it all from his corner, a silent, brooding statue. He didn't offer to help, and no one asked him. He was an island in the room, the human embodiment of the cold outside. As the work wound down, the exhaustion they had all been holding at bay began to crash over them. The adrenaline from the crash, the rescue, and the confrontation ebbed, leaving behind a profound, soul-deep weariness. Joe yawned, a wide, jaw-cracking yawn that he tried to stifle with the back of his hand. "You should get some rest," Susan said, her own voice heavy with fatigue. She looked at the 3 road crewmen. "You can take the booths. They're not the most comfortable, but it's better than the floor. There are some spare blankets in the linen closet." "We can't take your blankets," Joe protested. "It's either that or watch you all turn into popsicles," Susan replied, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. It felt foreign on her face. "I insist." She distributed the blankets, thin, scratchy things she kept for emergencies, and the 3 men settled into 3 adjacent booths, their large frames crammed into the narrow spaces. They looked like oversized children in a dollhouse, but they accepted the comfort with grateful murmurs. Soon the deep, regular breathing of sleep began to emanate from their corner, a soft counter-rhythm to the storm. Susan stayed behind the counter, perched on her stool. She knew she should sleep, but her mind was a whirlwind. The ledger sat on the counter beside her, a dark accusation. Leo's revelation about Frank played on a loop in her head. Had Frank known what he was getting into? Had he been desperate or just naive? The man she had loved and built a life with now felt like a stranger, one whose ghost had just handed her an eviction notice. Her goal now was simple, elemental: make it to morning. Survive the night, survive Leo, and face the legal battle at dawn. It was a goal stripped of all its former complexity, reduced to its most primal form. The diner grew quieter, the only sounds the howling wind, the clanking radiator, and the soft snores from the booths. The fluorescent lights hummed their constant low note. Susan's eyelids grew heavy. The warmth of the diner, the full belly, and the sheer emotional drain of the night were pulling her toward oblivion. She must have dozed off because the next thing she knew, a soft sound jolted her awake. Her head snapped up. It was the sound of a stool scraping gently on the floor. Leo was standing up. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking towards the sleeping men. Then his gaze shifted to the back of the diner, towards the dark hallway that led to the restrooms and the basement door. Susan's heart hammered. What was he doing? Was he going for the generator? Was he looking for something else? Her hand crept under the counter, her fingers closing around the cool, heavy handle of a metal flashlight she kept there. It was a pitiful weapon, but it was something. But Leo didn't move toward the back. Instead, he walked quietly to the coffee maker. He picked up the empty glass carafe, filled it with water at the sink, and started a fresh brew. The gurgle and hiss of the machine sounded like a thunderclap in the silence. He stood there, his back to her, watching the coffee drip. The mundane normality of the action was utterly disorienting. After a few minutes, he poured a single mug of black coffee. Then he turned and walked toward the counter. Toward her, Susan's grip tightened on the flashlight. She straightened up, every muscle tense. He stopped a few feet away, placing the steaming mug on the counter in front of her. The gesture was so unexpected, so incongruous that she could only stare at it. "You look like you could use it," he said, his voice low, so as not to wake the others. The menacing tone was gone, replaced by a flat, weary neutrality. She didn't touch it. She just looked from the mug to his face. In the dimmed light of the sleeping diner, he looked younger, the sharp angles of his face softened by shadow. The butterfly bandage on his temple was a reminder of his humanity, a humanity he had worked very hard to conceal. "Why?" she asked, the single word loaded with suspicion. He leaned against the counter, not too close, but close enough for conversation. He looked out the window at the relentless white. "Because this is just a job for me," he said quietly. "It's not personal." "It's very personal to me," Susan whispered back, her voice raw. He nodded slowly, as if accepting the truth of that. "I know." He was silent for a long moment. "Frank was a nice guy. He talked about you all the time. About this place. He really believed in it." The mention of Frank's name, spoken without malice, was a fresh wound. "Then how can you do this?" Leo finally looked at her, and for a fleeting second she saw something in his eyes that wasn't calculation or coldness. It was a deep, profound exhaustion that mirrored her own. "Because nice guys don't always understand the fine print," he said. "And my employers aren't nice guys." He pushed the mug an inch closer to her. "Drink the coffee, Susan. The storm's not done with us yet. You need to stay sharp." Then he turned and walked back to his corner, leaving her alone with the steaming mug and a whirlwind of new, confusing thoughts. The enemy had just shown her a flicker of his own chains. He had given her a moment of warning and a cup of coffee. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a surrender, but it was a complication. She looked at the black liquid, then out at the blizzard, which showed no sign of relenting. Her goal was still to survive until morning. But now the path to that goal was shrouded in a new, unsettling fog. Who was Leo, really? And what else was coming with the dawn? She wrapped her hands around the warm mug, the heat seeping into her cold fingers, and waited for the night to end. The warmth from the ceramic mug seeped into Susan's palms, a small, localized defiance of the cold that had settled deep in her bones. Leo's words echoed in the silent diner, a discordant note in the symphony of the storm and the soft snores from the booths. "My employers aren't nice guys." It wasn't an apology. It was a statement of fact, a glimpse into the mechanics of the machine poised to crush her. She stared at the dark pool of coffee, then at his retreating back as he reclaimed his shadowy post. The simple act of bringing her coffee had thrown her entire perception of him into disarray. He was the enemy, a wolf at her door, yet he had just shown a flicker of, professional courtesy? A sliver of a conscience? It was a dangerous complication. To see him as purely evil was simpler. This ambiguity was its own kind of torment. Her immediate goal was a stark, singular point of focus in her exhausted mind. Survive until morning. The legal battle, the debt, the ghost of Frank's secret, that was a problem for the daylight. The night was about endurance. She took a tentative sip of the coffee. It was bitter and strong, exactly how she needed it. For a long while the diner held its breath. The only movements were the slow, rhythmic breathing of the sleeping road crew, and the occasional, almost imperceptible shift of Leo's weight in his corner. He was a statue of watchful patience, his eyes reflecting the dim, fluorescent light like chips of obsidian. Susan remained on her stool, the ledger a heavy, accusing presence beside her. She traced the worn cover with a finger, thinking of Frank's large, calloused hands holding it, his brow furrowed in concentration. Had he been scared? Had he felt this same cold knot of despair when he signed that loan? A secret he took to his grave? The betrayal was a fresh wound, layered over the old grief. It was a small sound that broke the fragile stalemate, a soft metallic clink from the direction of the booths. Susan's head turned slowly, her senses on high alert. Joe was sitting up, the thin blanket pooled around his waist. He wasn't looking at her or Leo. He was looking at his two companions, and with a subtle, almost imperceptible tilt of his head, he gestured towards the front windows. Kyle's eyes fluttered open instantly, no trace of grogginess in them. Ben, the large, quiet one, was already awake, his gaze fixed on Joe, waiting. There was a discipline to the exchange that was utterly alien to the exhausted, grateful road crew she had served soup to an hour ago. This was not the fumbling communication of half-frozen men. It was a silent, efficient signal, A cold dread entirely separate from the storm or Leo's threats began to uncoil in Susan's stomach. Joe caught her watching him. For a fraction of a second his eyes held hers, and the friendly, grateful demeanor was gone, replaced by a flat, unreadable mask. Then it was gone, smoothed over so quickly she almost doubted she'd seen it. He gave her a small, tired smile. "Just checking the windows," he murmured, his voice a low rumble. "That tape might not hold." He and Kyle rose together, moving with a quiet, coordinated purpose that belied their claimed exhaustion. They didn't amble over to the windows. They went to specific points, running their hands along the duct-taped seams, testing the strength of their earlier work. They didn't speak, but their eyes met frequently, a silent conversation passing between them. Susan's goal, which had been simple survival, now fractured into a more complex and terrifying objective. Understand the new threat. Were they just vigilant, competent men? Or was their presence, like Leo's, not the accident it seemed? The obstacle was her own isolation and the sheer number of variables. She was one woman, trapped with 4 men, at least 2 of whom were almost certainly lying to her, and all of whom were now acting in ways that prickled the hairs on the back of her neck. Her reaction was to remain perfectly still, a mouse hoping the predators wouldn't notice her. She sipped her coffee, feigning a calm she was far from feeling. Out of the corner of her eye she saw Leo. He had also noticed the change in the room's energy. He was no longer slouching against the wall, but was standing straighter, his head cocked, every line of his body taut with renewed focus. He was studying the road crew with the same intense scrutiny he had previously reserved for her. Joe finished his inspection and walked towards the counter, his heavy boots making soft thuds on the linoleum. "Doing okay, Susan?" he asked, his voice laced with a concern that now felt practiced, performative. "As well as can be expected," she replied, her voice carefully neutral. Her internal conflict was a raging torrent, her ingrained instinct for hospitality, the very core of who she was, warred with a rising primal fear. These men had stood by her against Leo. They had braved the storm to help with the generator. But now, the whispers, the silent signals, the sudden sharp alertness, it all felt wrong. Her compassion, that stubborn, defining trait, was being tested. Could she continue to offer them kindness? To trust the initial impression of decency in the face of such mounting suspicion? To treat them as guests felt naive, a potentially fatal error. To treat them as enemies could provoke the very confrontation she desperately needed to avoid. The choice was a moral crossroads. She chose compassion, not out of naivety, but as a strategy. Kindness could be a shield. It could disarm. It could lull them into a false sense of security. And on a deeper level, to abandon it felt like surrendering the last piece of her soul to the darkness gathering inside her diner. "There's more coffee if you want it," she said, gesturing to the pot with a hand she willed not to tremble. "And there are some stale donuts in the kitchen. They're not great, but they're something." Joe's smile widened, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "That's mighty kind of you. We might take you up on that later." He leaned against the counter, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "That fella," he nodded almost imperceptibly towards Leo. "He's been quiet. You still feel okay about him being here?" It was a clever question, designed to align himself with her, to paint Leo as the sole source of danger. It was the kind of question a good guy would ask. Susan met his gaze, her own expression carefully crafted. "I don't have much choice, do I? We're all just trying to get through the night." She was deflecting, refusing to be drawn into his narrative. She saw a flicker of something, annoyance, in his eyes before he nodded in agreement. "Ain't that the truth?" He pushed off the counter. "Well, try to get some rest. We'll keep an eye out." "We'll keep an eye out." The words should have been comforting. Instead, they felt like a declaration of ownership. As Joe returned to the booth, Susan's mind raced. She needed information. She needed a weapon. Her eyes scanned the familiar landscape of her diner. The cast-iron skillet was still on the kitchen wall. The heavy flashlight was under the counter. But against 4 men, they were pathetic defenses. Her greatest weapon was her knowledge of this space, the territory itself. She made a decision. She needed to move, to break the static tension, to test their reactions. "I'm going to check the generator," she announced to the room, her voice louder than necessary. "Make sure the exhaust vent in the kitchen window is clear. Don't want us all dying of carbon monoxide poisoning." It was a logical, practical action, but her real goal was to get to the kitchen, to the knife block, to the back door. to see if their behavior changed when she moved out of sight. All four men looked at her. Leo's gaze was sharp, analytical. Joe's was carefully neutral. Kyle and Ben watched her with an unnerving intensity. "You want me to check it?" Joe offered, starting to rise again. "I've done it 100 times," she said, a little too briskly. "I know what to look for." She needed to assert her authority, to remind them this was her domain. She slid off the stool and walked towards the kitchen's double swing doors. The journey of 10 feet felt like a mile. She could feel their eyes on her back, a physical pressure. She pushed through the doors into the relative darkness of the kitchen. The familiar smells of grease and disinfectant a small comfort. Her heart was hammering. She moved quickly to the back door, checking the small high window she'd had installed to monitor the propane tank levels. It was completely frosted over, a solid sheet of white. She then went to the generator, making a show of inspecting the exhaust hose she'd fed through a makeshift vent in the window above the sink. It was fine. Her true objective was the knife block on the far counter. As she passed it, her hand darted out and closed around the handle of the heaviest one, a stout, sharp chef's knife. She slid it silently from the block. The weight of it in her hand was both terrifying and empowering. She tucked it quickly into the wide waistband of her apron, the long handle pressing cold and hard against her spine, hidden by the bulk of her thermal shirt and the apron's fabric. The violation of taking a weapon from her own kitchen against her guests sent a fresh wave of shame through her, but it was swiftly followed by a grim resolve. She took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing pulse, and pushed back through the swing doors into the diner. The scene that greeted her made her blood run cold. The 3 road crewmen were no longer in their booths. They were standing in a loose huddle near the front of the diner, their backs to her. Leo was still in his corner, but he was now standing fully alert, his body angled towards them, his posture rigid. The air was thick with a silent, palpable tension. They had been talking, and her entrance had cut them off. They turned almost in unison as the doors swung shut behind her. Joe's face was a careful blank. Kyle looked startled, guilty. Ben's expression was, as always, unreadable. "Everything looked good?" Joe asked, his voice a little too casual. "Fine," Susan said, her own voice tight. She walked back to her stool, hyper-aware of the concealed knife against her back. Every step felt exposed. Vent is clear. She resumed her position behind the counter, the ledger to her left, the now cold mug of coffee to her right. The fragile pretense of a few hours ago was shattered. The diner was now a battlefield, the lines drawn in the invisible currents of suspicion and fear. The road crew's earlier kindness now felt like a carefully constructed lie, a performance designed to lower her guard. Their discipline, their whispered conferences, their sudden vigilance, it all pointed to a purpose far beyond simply surviving the storm. Leo was watching her again, and in his eyes she saw a reflection of her own dawning realization. They were not allies. They were 2 separate threats trapped in the same cage, and a third, unknown danger had just revealed itself. The wind screamed, a high banshee wail that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. The lights flickered violently, dimming to a sickly orange glow and holding there, casting long, dancing shadows that twisted the men's faces into grotesque masks. "This is it," Susan thought, her hand instinctively moving to the small of her back, her fingers brushing the hidden knife handle. The power's going out, but the lights didn't die. They surged back once more, the fluorescent tubes buzzing and sputtering erratically. In the unstable, strobing light, Susan's eyes, drawn by a sudden movement, fell to the floor near Joe's feet. When he and the others had rushed back from their huddle, he had knocked over one of the wet, discarded gloves he'd left by the radiator. It wasn't just a glove. Lying on the checkerboard linoleum, starkly visible in the erratic light, was a walkie-talkie. It was a heavy-duty industrial model, not a consumer-grade toy. And nestled beside it, partly hidden by the glove's cuff, was a badge. A silver shield gleamed in the flickering light. Susan's breath caught in her throat. Her eyes snapped up to meet Joe's. He was staring right at her, and he knew she had seen it. All the practiced friendliness drained from his face, replaced by a cold, hard finality. The mask was off. The lights flickered one last time, and with a dying hum, they went out completely, plunging the Crossroads diner into an absolute, blinding darkness. In the sudden, terrifying silence that followed, broken only by the triumphant howl of the storm, a single, calm voice cut through the black. "Well, Susan," Joe said, his voice no longer that of a grateful road worker, but of a man in command. It seems we have a lot more to talk about than the weather. The darkness was absolute, a suffocating blanket that swallowed the world whole. For a heart-stopping moment, there was only the sound of the storm's triumphant roar and the frantic thumping of Susan's own heart. Her hand was still pressed against the cold handle of the knife hidden in her apron, a pathetic secret in the face of the unknown threat now fully revealed. Then a beam of stark white light cut through the black, pinning her in its glare. It came from a heavy-duty flashlight in Joe's hand. He didn't point it like a man trying to see. He held it like a weapon, its intensity forcing her to squint. "Nobody move," Joe's voice commanded, all traces of the weary, grateful road crewman gone. It was the voice of authority, flat and hard. Susan heard the rustle of clothing, the soft scuff of a boot on linoleum. She couldn't see the others, but she could feel them moving, fanning out in the darkness with a discipline that was terrifying. Her goal, which had been a desperate scramble for control, now shrunk to a single primal instinct. Don't die. Don't provoke them. The obstacle was the complete unknown. Who were they, cops? The badge suggested it. But why the deception? Why the performance? The walkie-talkie meant they had communication, or had had it. They were not victims of the storm. They were using it. Leo. Joe's voice cut through the dark, the beam of his light swinging away from Susan to sweep across the counter. "We know you're there. Let's all just stay calm." There was no answer from the corner. Leo had become part of the shadows. "Susan," Joe said, the light returning to her, slightly less blinding now, a concession to conversation. "I need you to listen very carefully. We are federal officers. The man in the corner, Leo Walsh, is a person of extreme interest to us. He is dangerous." The words landed like physical blows. Federal officers. Extreme interest, dangerous. They confirmed her fears and introduced new, more profound ones. Leo's story about the loan, his cold calculation, it all clicked into a horrifying new configuration. He wasn't just a loan shark's enforcer. He was something worse. Her reaction was a vortex of conflicting emotions. A bizarre flicker of relief that they were law enforcement was instantly crushed by a wave of betrayal. They had lied to her. They had used her kindness, her sanctuary, as a staging ground. And they had put her in the crosshairs of whatever this was. You lied to me," she whispered. The words choked with a hurt that felt childish even as she felt it. "It was necessary," Joe replied, his voice devoid of apology. "Our operation was compromised. Walsh was supposed to be met at a location 20 miles from here. He must have suspected the trap, taken a back road, and the storm did the rest. When we saw his truck in your ditch, we had to improvise." Improvise. The word was so cold, so clinical. Her life, her safety, her diner, just variables in their improvisation. "What do you want from me?" Susan asked, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. The knife against her back felt like a mockery. What was she supposed to do, fight the FBI? "For now, just stay put and stay quiet," Joe said. "Kyle, the generator." The beam of a second flashlight clicked on, held by Kyle. He moved with purpose towards the kitchen doors. Susan heard him push through, and a moment later, the familiar sputtering cough of the Honda generator echoed from the back. It chugged to life. And a moment after that, a single bare bulb hanging over the kitchen pass-through flickered on, casting a weak, jaundiced glow over a small section of the diner. In the dim light, the scene was surreal. Joe stood near the front door, his posture that of a soldier holding a position. Ben was a silent mountain near the booths, his eyes constantly scanning the darkness beyond the circle of light. And Leo was still in his corner, but now he was visible. He had pulled a small, wicked-looking folding knife from his pocket, holding it low and ready at his side. His eyes met Susan's across the room. There was no fear in them, only a cold, furious resignation. He had been hunted to ground. "It's over, Walsh," Joe said, his voice calm. "The storm's clearing. By first light, this place will be surrounded. There's nowhere to run." Leo's lips curled into a sneer. "You think I'm afraid of your friends in their shiny jackets? You think I'll just walk out of here with you?" "That's the idea," Joe said. "I'm not going back to a black site, Joe, or whatever your name is. I'd rather take my chances with the storm." His gaze flickered to Susan. "Or make my own chances." The threat was implicit, a serpent slithering through the tense air. He was telling them he would use her as a hostage, a shield, a bargaining chip. The cold knot in Susan's stomach tightened into a fist of pure ice. She was no longer a person. She was a piece on a chessboard between two opposing forces, both of which saw her as expendable. Her goal shifted once more. It was no longer about the diner or the debt or even survival in a general sense. It was about navigating the next few minutes without getting caught in the crossfire. She had to be a ghost, a non-entity. The obstacle was her very presence. She was the civilian in the operational zone. She was the variable neither side had fully accounted for. Kyle emerged from the kitchen, his face grim. Generator's running, but it's shaky. Fuel line might be gunked up. We've got power for the furnace and this light, but that's it. It's enough, Joe said, never taking his eyes off Leo. We just have to wait for dawn. And so, they waited. The night stretched on, an eternity measured in the labored chugging of the generator and the relentless beat of the storm. The wind began to lessen, its fury gradually diminishing from a scream to a moan and finally to a weary sigh. The silence that slowly took its place was somehow more ominous. Susan remained on her stool, her body aching with a fatigue so deep it felt like a physical illness. Joe and his team maintained their positions, a perimeter of tense vigilance. Leo stood like a statue in his corner, his knife gleaming dully in the weak light. Susan's mind raced, trying to piece it all together. Leo. A man so dangerous it took a federal team and an elaborate sting to catch him. A man who knew about Frank's secret loan. What had Frank gotten involved with? The man who flipped pancakes and told bad jokes had borrowed money from people connected to this. The thought was so monstrous it threatened to unravel her sanity. The foundation of her past, already cracked by Leo's earlier revelation, now felt like it was turning to quicksand. The first hint of dawn was not a color, but a subtle lightening of the oppressive black outside the windows to a deep, monochrome gray. The shapes of the snowdrifts became visible, monstrous, sculpted forms that had buried the world. As the light grew, so did the tension in the diner. Joe became more alert, his head cocked, listening for something beyond the dying wind. Leo straightened up, his knuckles white around the handle of his knife. Susan found herself holding her breath. Then she heard it, a faint, distant whine growing steadily louder. It wasn't the wind. It was the high-revving engine of a snowmobile. Then another, and another. Joe allowed himself a small, tight smile. That'll be our ride. He moved to the front window, brushing away a patch of frost with his sleeve. Kyle joined him, his hand resting on the butt of a pistol holstered under his parka, a weapon Susan now realized had been there all along. They're here, Kyle said. Through the window, Susan could see them, a line of snowmobiles, maybe a dozen, their headlights cutting bright cones through the pre-dawn gloom. They fanned out, surrounding the diner, their engines falling silent one by one. The men dismounting were not in uniform. They were clad in black tactical gear, their faces obscured by helmets and balaclavas. They moved with a fluid, lethal grace, taking up positions behind the snowdrifts, the barrels of assault rifles pointed at the diner. This was not the county sheriff's department. This was a SWAT team. A new sound joined the morning, the amplified metallic crackle of a loudspeaker. Attention inside the diner. This is the FBI. The building is surrounded. You will exit the building one at a time. With your hands empty and clearly visible. Any deviation from this order will be met with lethal force. You have 30 seconds to comply. The voice was inhuman, a robot's command echoing across the frozen landscape. It was the voice of the outside world finally breaking through, and it was more terrifying than the storm had ever been. Horror washed over Susan, a cold, sickening wave. They thought she was one of them. They thought she was with Leo, or with these undercover agents, or part of some criminal enterprise. She was trapped inside with armed men, and outside more armed men were prepared to shoot her on sight. Her goal was now terrifyingly simple: get out alive. Prove I'm not one of them. The obstacle was the sheer overwhelming force outside and the volatile standoff inside. Joe turned from the window, his face all business. All right, Walsh, you heard the man. It's time to go. He unholstered his own pistol, not pointing it yet, but making its presence known. Drop the knife. On the floor, now. Leo didn't move. His eyes were wild, darting from Joe to the windows to Susan. He was a cornered animal. I'm not going with you, he snarled. You don't have a choice, Joe said, his voice dangerously calm. Susan, he commanded without looking at her. Get down on the floor. Behind the counter, now. It was a direct order, a chance to get out of the line of fire. But as Susan began to slide off her stool, Leo moved. It was a blur of motion, He didn't charge Joe or make for the door. He lunged across the room toward Susan. His intention was clear. A hostage. "No!" Susan screamed, stumbling backward. Her hip slammed into the counter's edge, and the hidden knife handle dug painfully into her spine. Joe shouted, "Walsh, stop!" But Leo kept coming, his hand outstretched to grab her. Susan's reaction was pure, unthinking instinct. Her survival was no longer an abstract concept. It was a man with a knife lunging at her. Her hand, moving of its own volition, yanked the chef's knife from her waistband. She didn't swing it. She simply held it out in front of her, a trembling, desperate barrier. Leo saw it too late. He tried to pull up, his momentum carrying him forward. His torso slammed into her outstretched arm. There was a sickening, soft resistance followed by a hot, wet sensation on her hand. Leo gasped, a short, sharp intake of air. He stopped, his body rigid, his eyes wide with shock. He looked down at the handle of the knife, now buried to the hilt just below his ribcage. He looked back up at Susan, his expression one of pure, uncomprehending astonishment. Then his legs buckled. He crumpled to the checkerboard floor, landing with a heavy final thud. A dark, rapidly expanding stain bloomed across the front of his shirt, a shocking crimson on the faded plaid. Silence. The only sound was Susan's ragged, sobbing breath. She stared, numb with shock, at the knife in her hand, now slick with blood. She had done that. She had stabbed a man. The world had narrowed to the sight of Leo's body on her floor and the warm, sticky feeling on her skin. Joe was at her side in an instant. He didn't look at her with anger or accusation, but with a grim, professional assessment. He kicked Leo's folding knife away across the linoleum, then knelt, pressing 2 fingers against Leo's neck. "He's alive," Joe said after a moment, his voice tight. "But he needs a medic now." He looked up at Kyle. "Signal them. Tell them we have a man down, non-hostile. Tell them the primary target is in custody." Kyle rushed to the front door, unbolting it and waving his arms at the tactical team outside. Susan couldn't move. She was frozen, her gaze locked on Leo's ashen face. His eyes were open, staring at the ceiling, his breath coming in shallow, wet gasps. The man who had threatened her, who had held her financial ruin in his hands, was now dying on her diner floor by her hand. There was no triumph, only a hollow, screaming horror. The front door burst open, and the tactical team swarmed in, a flood of black gear and shouted commands. The diner, her quiet, failing kingdom, was suddenly filled with shouting men, radios crackling, and the stomping of heavy boots on her clean floor. Someone gently pried the bloody knife from her frozen fingers. Someone else guided her to a booth, wrapping a shock blanket around her shoulders. She sat, shivering violently, watching the chaotic ballet unfold. They worked on Leo, applying pressure to the wound, preparing a stretcher. They spoke to Joe in low, urgent tones. After what felt like an eternity, the diner began to clear. Leo was carried out, his face covered by an oxygen mask. The tactical team filtered out, their job done. Only Joe, Kyle, and Ben remained, along with a man in a dark windbreaker with FBI stenciled in bright yellow letters on the back. Joe came and sat opposite her in the booth. His face was etched with exhaustion, but his eyes were kinder than they had been all night. "Susan," he said, his voice soft. "My name is Special Agent Joseph Miller. That man was Leo Walsh." She just stared at him, unable to form words. "We've been after him for 18 months, Miller continued. "He's a facilitator, a fixer, for a very dangerous, very secretive syndicate. They move money, weapons, people, anything for a price. Your husband, Frank, he got in over his head with them." Susan found her voice, a broken whisper. "The loan—" Miller nodded. "It was a trap. A way to gain leverage over a business on a remote stretch of highway. A place to stash things, to move people through without notice. When Frank died, they lost their inside man. But the debt remained. Walsh was here to collect one way or another. Either you paid, which you couldn't, or you became their new asset. The truth was a sledgehammer. Frank hadn't just made a bad financial decision. He had inadvertently sold their lives, their dreams, to monsters. The Crossroads Diner wasn't just a failing business. It had been targeted as a criminal waypoint. The knowledge was so vile it made her nauseous. I killed him," she stammered, looking at the dark stain on her floor. "You defended yourself," Miller said firmly. "He was assaulting you. The knife. That was smart. It probably saved your life. He would have used you to get out of here, and then he would have killed you." His words were meant to comfort, but they just echoed in the hollow space inside her. The FBI agent in the windbreaker approached the table. "Ma'am, we're going to need a full statement, and we'll need to process the scene." She nodded dumbly. Process the scene? Her home, her life. As the agent walked away, Miller leaned closer. "There's one more thing, Susan." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Walsh wasn't working alone. The syndicate knows this location was compromised. They know we have him, and they know you were the one who helped bring him down." He let the words hang in the air, their implication colder than the lingering chill from the storm. "You need to be careful," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "The people he worked for, they don't forgive, and they don't forget." He stood up, leaving her sitting alone in the booth. Outside, the dawn was breaking, casting a pale, clean light over the ravaged landscape. The blizzard was over. The immediate danger had passed. Leo was in custody. The debt, she realized with a shock, was likely void, a casualty of a much larger war. But as she looked around her diner, at the bloody stain on the floor, the duct-taped windows, the overturned stool, she knew with a certainty that dwarfed all her previous fears. This wasn't over. The storm had passed, but a different, more insidious darkness had been let in. And it knew her name. The amplified voice from outside hung in the air, a metallic echo of finality. "You have 30 seconds to comply." Susan's world had shrunk to the sight of Leo Walsh bleeding out on her checkerboard floor. The warmth of his blood was a searing brand on her hand, the coppery smell filling her nostrils, thick and cloying. The chaos that erupted was a blur of black tactical gear and shouted commands. Men swarmed her diner, their heavy boots tracking snow and mud over the clean linoleum. They were a faceless, armored hive, their movements efficient and brutal. She was guided, almost shoved into a booth, a shock blanket draped over her shoulders like a shroud. She didn't feel the cold. She felt nothing but a numb, ringing horror. She watched as they worked on Leo, a frantic, focused ballet of pressure bandages and hissed instructions. He was lifted onto a stretcher, his face pale and waxy under the oxygen mask, and carried out into the growing dawn. The primary threat, the wolf at her door, was gone. But the diner was now occupied by a different kind of predator. Special Agent Joseph Miller sat opposite her, his face a mask of professional sympathy that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Susan," he began, his voice a low, calming rumble meant to de-escalate, but it only made her skin crawl. "You're in shock. You need to understand you did the right thing. You defended yourself against a very dangerous man." Her goal was simple, primal. Understand. Make sense of the nightmare. Her mind, reeling from the violence, clung to his words like a lifeline. "Frank," she whispered, the name a plea. "The loan." Miller nodded, a grim confirmation. "A trap. They target places like this, remote, struggling. Your husband was in over his head. Walsh was here to collect the debt or take the asset. That's you and this diner." The truth was a physical blow, worse than the financial ruin. Her marriage, her memories, the very foundation of her life for the past 20 years, was built on a lie that had festered into this monstrous reality. The Crossroads Diner wasn't just a failing dream. It was a target painted on her back. The other agent, the one in the FBI windbreaker, approached the table. "Ma'am, we need to secure the scene and get your official statement." "It's standard procedure." He was younger, with a clean-cut jaw and an air of impatient authority. Agent Miller stood, giving her a reassuring pat on the shoulder that felt like a claim staked. "Cooperate with Agent Davis, Susan," Miller said. "We'll get this sorted out." He moved away, joining Kyle and Ben, who were now huddled by the front door, speaking in low, urgent tones with the tactical team leader. Their earlier personas as simple road crew were completely shed. They were federal agents, and the diner was their crime scene. Agent Davis placed a digital recorder on the table. "Start from the beginning, Miss Susan. When did the suspect first arrive?" Her statement was a halting, broken thing. She described the sound of the crash, helping the dazed Leo inside, the growing sense of dread, the arrival of the road crew, the confrontation over the ledger, the final, terrifying lunge. She left out the part about hiding the knife. Some instincts for self-preservation remained. As she spoke, she watched the other agents. They weren't just processing the scene. They were searching. They opened drawers behind the counter, peered into the kitchen. their gloved hands moving with a purpose that went beyond cataloging evidence from the stabbing. Her new goal, emerging from the fog of shock, was to get them out of her home. The violation was profound. These men, who had eaten her food and accepted her shelter, were now picking through the bones of her life with clinical detachment. The obstacle was their absolute authority. They had guns, badges, and the full weight of the federal government behind them. She was a witness, a victim, but in their eyes she was also part of the landscape of the crime. Did the suspect, Leo Walsh, say anything else? Davis pressed, his tone sharp. Anything about contacts? A package? Any mention of a Grey Lord? Susan shook her head, bewildered. No, nothing like that. It was all about the money. The loan. Davis's eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of skepticism that made her stomach clench. He didn't believe her. Or he believed she knew more than she was saying. From across the room, Miller's voice, raised in frustration, cut through the murmur. I don't care what the thermal showed before the storm. The priority is Walsh. He's the key to the whole network. This location is secondary. The tactical team leader, a broad-shouldered man with a scar cutting through his eyebrow, shook his head. Protocol is protocol, Miller. We sweep and secure. My men reported a heat signature anomaly in the basement before the whiteout fully set in. We have to check it. The basement. Susan's blood ran cold. The basement was a damp, concrete-walled space filled with the grumbling oil furnace, old holiday decorations, and Frank's ancient locked tool chest. A place she rarely went. Why would they care about her basement? Miller shot a quick, unreadable glance at Susan before turning back to the team leader. Fine, but make it fast. The storm's breaking. I want this wrapped up before the local press gets wind of it. Two of the tactical agents moved toward the basement door, a heavy, reinforced thing next to the kitchen. Susan's heart began to hammer again. A fresh, inexplicable fear took root. Something was wrong. The pieces weren't fitting. Miller's urgency to leave, the tactical team's insistence on the basement, the way Davis was looking at her. It felt less like an investigation and more like a race. Agent Miller, she said, her voice trembling as she stood up, the shock blanket falling to the seat. What's in the basement? What are you looking for? Miller turned, his expression carefully neutral. Just procedure, Susan. We have to ensure there are no other threats. For your safety. It was a lie. She could feel it. The same instinct that had screamed at her about Leo was screaming now, louder, more desperate. The two agents at the basement door tried the handle. It's locked, one of them called out. Susan, the key, Miller said, his voice taking on a subtle, commanding edge. Her goal was now to delay, to understand. It's just junk down there, she protested, a weak, futile defense. Old furniture, the furnace. The key, Miller repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. It was no longer a request. With a sinking feeling of dread, Susan walked behind the counter, her legs like lead. She kept a spare key on a hook underneath next to the old laminated fire escape plan. Her fingers fumbled, brushing against the cold metal. As she handed it to Miller, their eyes met. For a fraction of a second, the professional mask slipped, and she saw something hard and calculating in his gaze. It was the same look Leo had given her when he'd held the ledger. The agent unlocked the door and pulled it open, revealing a yawning mouth of darkness that smelled of damp concrete and fuel oil. The two tactical agents, their rifles raised, clicked on the lights and descended, their boots echoing on the wooden steps. The diner fell into a tense silence, broken only by the static crackle of radios. Susan stood frozen by the counter, Agent Davis watching her closely. Miller paced near the door, his jaw tight. Kyle and Ben had positioned themselves near the front windows, their postures rigid. Seconds stretched into a minute. Then another. A voice, sharp and clear, echoed from the basement. Miller, you need to see this. Miller's head snapped up. He didn't look surprised. He looked resigned. He shot a look at Kyle and Ben, a look that was pure, unadulterated communication. Then he moved, not towards the basement, but towards the front door. Kyle, Ben, secure the witness, he barked, his voice shedding all pretense of calm. In an instant, the atmosphere in the diner shattered. Kyle and Ben turned, their service pistols drawn, not pointed at her but held in a ready position. Their faces were no longer those of friendly rescuers. They were hard, impersonal masks. What are you doing? Susan stammered, backing away until the counter dug into her spine. Her goal was now pure survival. The obstacle was the terrifying, instantaneous shift. The men with the badges had become the threat. "Just stay calm, Susan," Ben said, his voice low, but the kindness was gone. It was an order. Agent Davis stood up, his hand moving to his own holster, his face a mixture of confusion and alarm. "Miller, what the hell is this?" "What's the play?" Miller ignored him, his focus on bolting the front door shut again. The dawn light, now a clear pale gray, streamed through the windows, illuminating the bloody stain on the floor and the grim determination on his face. The tactical team leader emerged from the basement, his face ashen. He wasn't holding a weapon. In his gloved hands, he held a sleek black waterproof case about the size of a large laptop. It was beaded with moisture, and a small red LED light on its side blinked rhythmically. "Where's the rest of the team?" the leader asked, his voice tight. "They're not responding," Miller said, his back to them as he peered through a crack in the window covering. "Comms are jammed. Local frequencies, too. It's a ghost net." "It was a setup," the leader hissed, holding up the case. "This wasn't just a safe house. It was a dead drop. And we just walked into the middle of a retrieval." Susan's mind raced, trying to catch up. Dead drop, retrieval. The words meant nothing and everything. The case. They had been looking for the case. Leo hadn't come just for her. He had come for whatever was in her basement. And these agents, or at least some of them, weren't here to stop him. They were here to take it for themselves. Agent Davis finally understood. He drew his pistol, aiming it at Miller. "You're dirty, Miller? All this time?" Miller turned slowly, a sad, almost pitying smile on his face. "It's not about being dirty, Davis. It's about understanding which side is going to win." He gestured to the case. "That is a down payment on a very comfortable retirement, something the government pension fund just can't match." The internal conflict for Susan was paralyzing. Who was the enemy? Who was an ally? Davis seemed to be the only one on the right side, but he was one man against Miller, Kyle, and Ben. The tactical team leader was a wild card, his men still downstairs. "Stand down, Miller," Davis commanded, his voice steady, but the barrel of his gun wavered slightly. "It's over." Before Miller could respond, a new sound cut through the tension. It was the crunch of heavy tires on packed snow moving fast. Then the roar of engines, not snowmobiles but powerful trucks, followed by the screech of brakes right outside the diner. Miller's smile widened. "No, Davis, it's just starting." From outside, a different voice, amplified but distorted, blared through a megaphone. "FBI, we have the building surrounded. Come out with your hands up." Davis's face contorted in confusion. "What? That's our backup." "No, it's not," the tactical team leader said, his voice grim as he looked out of the window. "Those aren't our vehicles." Susan risked a glance through the duct-taped glass. Parked haphazardly in her lot, surrounded by the FBI snowmobiles, were 3 black armored Suburbans with tinted windows. Men in black combat gear, but without the clear FBI markings, were spilling out, using the vehicles for cover. They moved with a predatory grace that was even more frightening than the official team's disciplined efficiency. Miller looked at the leader. "The Grey Lord's men. They're here for the package. And they're not leaving any witnesses." Panic, pure and undiluted, seized Susan. She was trapped in a shooting gallery between 2 groups of armed men, neither of which had any regard for her life. The diner was no longer a sanctuary or a crime scene. It was a kill box. Her goal was now reduced to its most elemental form: find a hole, hide. Davis made his choice. He swung his pistol towards the new threat outside, firing 2 shots through the window. The glass exploded inward, a cascade of shards mixing with the snow swirling in from outside. The response was immediate and devastating. The world outside erupted in a storm of gunfire. The front windows of the diner dissolved into a spiderweb of cracks before shattering completely. Bullets ripped through the vinyl booths, sending stuffing flying into the air. The pie display case exploded in a shower of glass and ceramic. "Get down!" Davis yelled, grabbing Susan and pulling her roughly to the floor behind the solid base of the counter. She landed hard, the impact jarring her teeth. The air was filled with the deafening roar of automatic weapons, the thwack of bullets embedding themselves in the walls, and the screams of men. Kyle, caught in the open, cried out and spun around, a dark bloom appearing on his shoulder before he crumpled behind a booth. Ben returned fire from the kitchen doorway, his large frame providing a massive target. Miller and the tactical team leader were pinned down near the front, firing through the shattered windows. Susan curled into a ball, her hands over her ears, but the sound was a physical force pounding against her. The smell of cordite blood and cold air created a nauseating cocktail. This was it. She was going to die here in the ruins of her dream, caught in a war she didn't understand for a reason she couldn't comprehend. Davis fired methodically beside her, his face a grim mask. "Stay down," he shouted over the din. Her eyes, wild with terror, scanned the floor beneath the counter. They landed on the heavy cast-iron skillet that had fallen from its hook during the chaos. It was a relic, a symbol of 1,000 peaceful meals. Now it was just a heavy object. Then her gaze fell on something else. The basement door was still open, the light from below casting a weak yellow glow onto the bottom steps. It was a mouth of darkness, but it was also the only way out of the line of fire. That was her hole. Her goal crystallized with blinding clarity: get to the basement. The obstacle was the 10 feet of open, bullet-riddled space between the counter and the basement door. She looked at Davis, who was focused on the firefight. She looked at the skillet. It was a ridiculous weapon, but it was all she had. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she made her choice. As Davis popped up to fire another volley, Susan grabbed the handle of the skillet. It was impossibly heavy, a solid weight of cold iron. Using all her strength, she scrambled to her feet and lunged from behind the counter. "Susan, no," Davis yelled, but his voice was lost in the gunfire. She didn't run in a straight line. She zigzagged, a clumsy, terrified dash, the skillet held in front of her like a medieval shield. A bullet whizzed past her ear, so close she felt the wind of its passage. Another sparked off the linoleum by her feet. She didn't look back. She didn't look at Miller or the others. Her entire being was focused on that dark, open doorway. She reached the top of the stairs just as a fresh barrage of gunfire chewed up the wall, where she had been standing a second before. Without a backward glance, she plunged into the darkness, descending the steps 2 at a time, the cold, damp air of the basement washing over her like a blessing. She was halfway down when a shadow detached itself from the wall below. One of the tactical agents who had been searching the basement stood there, his rifle raised, his face obscured by his helmet.
"Stop right there!"
he commanded. Susan didn't think. She acted. With a guttural cry born of pure terror and desperation, she swung the cast-iron skillet. It was an awkward, clumsy swing, but the weight of the iron did the work. It connected with the side of the agent's helmet with a sickening metallic clang. He grunted, stumbling sideways, his rifle clattering to the concrete floor. He wasn't unconscious, but he was dazed, slumping against the wall. Susan didn't wait to see more. She leaped over him, her feet hitting the cold, damp concrete of the basement floor. She spun around, her breath coming in ragged, sobbing gasps, and slammed the heavy basement door shut above her. Her fingers fumbled for the old, rusty deadbolt. It screeched in protest, but she threw her weight against it, forcing it home. For a moment, there was relative silence. The gunfire was muffled, a distant thunderstorm raging above her head. She was safe. She was in the dark. But as her eyes adjusted to the dim light from the single bare bulb, she saw the other tactical agent. He was lying on the floor near the furnace, his throat slit, his vacant eyes staring at the cobweb-covered ceiling. The search had not been peaceful, and standing over him, holding the bloody, sleek black case, was Leo Walsh. He was pale, his shirt stained dark with his own blood, and he leaned heavily against Frank's old tool chest for support. But he was alive, and in his free hand he held a pistol, pointed directly at her chest. His face was a grimace of pain, but his eyes held that same cold, unnerving focus. "The skillet," he rasped, a faint bloody bubble forming on his lips, a classic. But it won't work twice. Susan stood frozen at the bottom of the stairs, the heavy iron pan still clutched in her hand. There was nowhere to run. The door behind her was bolted, but it wouldn't hold for long against the men upstairs. And in front of her was the man she had stabbed, holding her at gunpoint. Leo's gaze shifted from her to the case in his hand, then back to her face. A strange, twisted smile touched his lips. "It seems we're both trapped down here, Susan," he wheezed. "And the only way out is through each other." The cast-iron skillet felt impossibly heavy in Susan's hand, a dead weight of cold, greasy iron. At the bottom of the basement stairs, Leo Walsh leaned against her late husband's tool chest, his face the color of ash, a dark, blooming stain on his flannel shirt. The pistol in his hand, however, was perfectly steady, its barrel a single, unblinking eye aimed at her heart. "The skillet," he rasped, a faint, bloody bubble popping on his lips. "A classic. But it won't work twice." Susan's mind screamed at her to move, to swing, to do anything, but her body was locked in place, a statue of terror. The gunfire from upstairs was a muffled storm, but down here in the damp, frigid air, the only sounds were Leo's ragged breathing and the frantic thumping of her own heart. Her goal, which had been a desperate flight to the basement, had now twisted into a nightmare. She had traded a firefight for a standoff with a dying man who had nothing left to lose. They're going to break through that door, she managed to stammer, her voice a dry croak. She gestured weakly with the skillet towards the bolted door above them. I know, Leo wheezed. He shifted his weight and a spasm of pain contorted his features. The movement caused the sleek black case in his other hand to swing slightly. But they're not the ones I'm worried about right now. It's the ones outside. The Grey Lord's men, they're thorough. The who? What is that? Susan's eyes darted from the gun to the case. What is in that thing? What did Frank get us into? A strange, grim smile touched Leo's lips. Frank was a means to an end. A convenient, desperate man with a conveniently isolated property. He coughed, a wet, hacking sound that made him wince. This is a ledger of sorts, but not of money. Of souls, locations, officials on a payroll. Enough to bring down a very large, very angry organization. He was telling her too much. That was never a good sign. It meant he didn't expect her to live to repeat it. The cold of the basement seeped through her clothes, but the chill in her soul was infinitely deeper. So this is it? She whispered, the skillet's handle digging into her palm. I lose everything? My husband, my business, my life? You lost your life the moment Frank signed that paper, Leo said, his voice fading in and out. I was just the delivery man for the eviction notice. A sudden, violent impact shook the basement door above them. A heavy thump that made the wooden frame shudder. Dust and bits of old paint rained down on the stairs. Shouted voices, indistinct but furious, filtered through the thick wood. Leo's eyes flicked towards the sound, and in that split second of distraction, Susan acted. It wasn't a thought-out plan. It was pure, desperate instinct. She didn't charge him. Instead, she threw the skillet. It was an awkward, underhanded toss, the heavy pan tumbling end over end through the dim air. It wasn't aimed at Leo, but at the rickety metal shelf unit next to him, the one crammed with old paint cans, motor oil, and rusty tools. The skillet connected with a deafening clangor. The shelf wobbled violently, and a cascade of heavy metal cans clattered to the concrete floor. One can of dark green paint hit the ground and burst open, splattering Leo's legs and the tool chest with a viscous, spreading pool. Another, a can of used motor oil, tipped over and began gushing its black, slick contents across the floor. Leo flinched, throwing his arm up to protect his face from the flying debris. His gun hand wavered. That was all the opening Susan needed. She didn't go for the gun. She went for the darkness. She turned and scrambled deeper into the basement, away from the single bare bulb that illuminated the stairs. She plunged into the labyrinth of stored memories and forgotten junk, past the grumbling furnace behind a stack of warped wooden chairs, and into the deepest, darkest corner where an old, moth-eaten sofa was pushed against the cinder block wall. She squeezed herself into the narrow gap between the sofa and the wall, pulling her knees to her chest, making herself as small as possible. The space was tight and smelled of dust and decay. She could hear the frantic scrabble of tiny claws, mice fleeing her intrusion. She didn't care. She held her breath, her entire body trembling. From her hiding spot, she heard Leo's furious, pain-filled curse, then another tremendous crack from above, the sound of splintering wood. The basement door was giving way. Walsh, FBI, drop your weapon. A voice boomed from the top of the stairs. It was Agent Davis. Susan risked a peek around the arm of the sofa. The door was hanging askew on its hinges. Davis stood silhouetted in the opening, his service pistol held in a two-handed grip aimed down the stairs. Behind him, the chaos of the firefight seemed to have lessened, replaced by sharp commands and moans of pain. Leo had used the commotion to his advantage. He was no longer by the tool chest. He had moved, a shadow melting into the deeper shadows near the back of the basement where the old coal chute was bricked up. Susan couldn't see him, but she could hear his labored breathing. It's over, Leo, Davis shouted, beginning a slow, cautious descent. The perimeter is secure. Miller and his boys are in custody. There's nowhere to go. Miller? In custody? The words barely registered. Susan's only goal was to remain invisible, a ghost in the ruins of her own life. Davis reached the bottom step, his boots crunching on the spilled contents of the shelf. He swept his gun and a small tactical flashlight across the basement. The beam danced over the furnace, the stacks of boxes, the body of the slain tactical agent. "Susan?" Davis called out, his voice softer.
Are you down here?
"Are you hurt?" She stayed silent, pressing herself harder against the cold wall. Trust was a currency she no longer possessed. The beam of his flashlight continued its search, moving closer to her hiding spot. It illuminated the dusty floral pattern of the old sofa. It was only a matter of seconds. Suddenly, from the darkness near the coal chute, a gunshot roared. Davis cried out and stumbled back, his flashlight clattering to the floor and spinning, sending crazy pinwheels of light across the ceiling. He'd been hit. Should have. "Taken the deal, Davis." Leo's voice gurgled from the shadows. "They offered you one." "Two." Susan watched in horror as Davis slumped against the bottom of the stairs, clutching his thigh. Blood welled between his fingers. His pistol had fallen just out of reach. The spinning flashlight came to a stop, its beam pointing directly at the old sofa. At Susan. For a moment, everything was still. The gunfire upstairs had stopped completely. The only sounds were Davis's pained grunts and the wet, rhythmic drag of Leo's breath. Then slow, deliberate footsteps. Leo emerged from the shadows, stepping into the edge of the flashlight's beam. He looked like a corpse reanimated. His face was a ghastly white, his movements stiff and puppet-like. He still held the black case. His pistol was now aimed at the helpless Agent Davis. "You're a stubborn man," Leo said, taking another shuffling step. "A good man. That's a dangerous combination in this line of work." He was going to execute him, right here in her basement. Susan's mind recoiled. Davis, for all his part in the deception, had tried to protect her. He was the only one who had seemed to care if she lived or died. Her goal shifted once more, propelled by a surge of defiance that felt alien in her numb soul. Stop him. Don't let him do this. The obstacle was the gun, his resolve, and her own crushing fear. She had no weapon. She was trapped. Leo raised his pistol, the barrel centering on Davis's forehead. Davis stared back, his jaw clenched, his eyes filled with a furious resignation. "Goodbye, Agent," Leo whispered. As his finger tightened on the trigger, Susan did the only thing she could think of. She screamed. It wasn't a scream of terror. It was a raw, primal shriek of rage. At Leo, at Frank, at the storm, at the universe that had systematically dismantled her life. The sound ripped through the stagnant basement air, shocking in its intensity. Leo flinched, his head snapping towards the source of the sound behind the sofa. The gunshot that followed was deafening in the confined space, but the bullet went wide, punching into the wooden stair above Davis's head. In that frozen moment of surprise, a figure descended the stairs with silent, lethal speed. It was one of the tactical team members from outside, the ones in the unmarked gear. He moved like a panther, his own weapon, a compact submachine gun, held ready. Leo saw him too late. He tried to swing his pistol around, but he was too slow, too weak. The tactical agent didn't shout a warning. He didn't demand surrender. He simply fired, 3 quick, controlled bursts. The shots were precise, clinical. One hit Leo's gun hand, spinning the pistol away into the darkness. The second and third struck him center mass. Leo jolted backward as if hit by a truck. The black case flew from his grasp, skittering across the oil-slicked concrete. He hit the ground hard, his body limp, his eyes wide with shock, staring at the cobweb-strewn ceiling. A final soft sigh escaped his lips, and then he was still. The tactical agent stepped over Davis without a glance, his focus entirely on the black case. He holstered his weapon, picked up the case, and inspected it quickly, wiping a smear of motor oil from its surface with his glove. The red LED light was still blinking rhythmically. He then turned his helmeted head towards the sofa, towards Susan. She stared back, paralyzed, still crouched in her hiding spot. She couldn't see his face, but she could feel the weight of his assessment. He knew she was there. He had known the whole time. For a long moment, he just looked at her. Then he gave a single, curt nod. It wasn't a gesture of reassurance or comfort. It was an acknowledgement. He had what he came for. She was irrelevant. He turned and walked back up the stairs, stepping over the splintered door and disappearing into the light above. Silence descended once more, deeper and more profound than before. The immediate threat was gone. Leo was dead. The case was taken. But Susan felt no relief, only a hollow, cavernous emptiness. Slowly, shakily, she unfolded herself from behind the sofa. Her legs threatened to buckle beneath her. She stepped out into the main area of the basement. her eyes avoiding the two bodies on the floor, the dead agent and now Leo. She focused on Agent Davis, who was trying to stem the flow of blood from his leg with a torn piece of his own shirt. "Are you—" She started, her voice a wrecked whisper. "I'll live," he grunted, his face pale. "Thanks to you." He looked at her, his expression a complex mix of pain, gratitude, and shame. "That was incredibly brave. Or incredibly stupid." "I don't know what it was," Susan said honestly. She felt nothing. The sound of more footsteps came from above, these ones heavy and official. A new team of agents, these in clearly marked FBI jackets, poured down the stairs. They swarmed the basement, their movements efficient and coordinated. One team attended to Davis, applying a proper field dressing to his wound. Another checked Leo for a pulse, finding none, before covering his body with a sheet. A third began photographing everything. Susan was gently but firmly guided up the stairs. The journey felt like an ascent from a tomb. As she emerged into her diner, the sight that greeted her stole what little breath she had left. It was a war zone. The front windows were gaping jagged holes letting in the cold, clean morning air. The vinyl booths were shredded, their white stuffing spilled out like grotesque innards. The counter was pockmarked with bullet holes. The floor was littered with brass shell casings, glittering amidst the broken glass and the dark, ominous stain where Leo had first fallen. The air was thick with the acrid stink of gunpowder and blood. And in the middle of it all, being handcuffed, were the men she had led into her sanctuary. Agent Miller, his face a mask of cold fury, was being read his rights by a stone-faced agent. He caught Susan's eye as she was led past, and his gaze was pure, undiluted hatred. Kyle and Ben were already cuffed, their heads bowed. The betrayal was a physical ache in her chest. Her kindness, her fundamental belief in helping others, had been her undoing. She had opened her door to wolves, and they had devoured everything. She was made to sit on the least damaged booth, a female agent wrapping a clean blanket around her shoulders. She watched, numb and detached as the scene was processed. The diner, her kingdom, her albatross, was now just a crime scene, a place of violence and death. The dream was not just dead. It was desecrated. A senior-looking agent with a kind, weary face approached her. "Miss Susan, I'm Special Agent in Charge Rollins. I know you've been through an unimaginable ordeal. We need to get a statement, and we need to get you to a hospital to be checked out." She just nodded. Words were beyond her. As Rollins spoke, her eyes drifted across the ruined room. They landed on the small black ledger, still sitting on the counter where Leo had left it. Someone had placed it in an evidence bag. The sight of it, that symbol of her financial despair, now felt trivial, almost quaint. Her debt, Frank's secret, the struggle to keep the doors open. It all seemed like a concerns from another lifetime, a pleasant dream that had curdled into this waking nightmare. She had believed that was her rock bottom. She now knew she had been merely scratching the surface. A paramedic approached, offering her a bottle of water. She took it with a trembling hand, but couldn't bring herself to drink. Agent Rollins followed her gaze to the ledger. "Try not to think about that right now, Ms. Susan. Given the circumstances, the financial issues, they're the least of your worries. We have victim support services that can help you navigate all of that." The words were meant to be comforting, but they only hammered home her total powerlessness. Her life was no longer her own. It was a problem to be navigated by faceless government agencies. She watched as Miller was led out in handcuffs. He didn't look at her again. He was a broken man, but the system that had created him, that had allowed this to happen, was still intact. The Grey Lord was still out there. The men in the black Suburbans had gotten what they came for. She was the only loose end. As the paramedic helped her to her feet to lead her outside to a waiting ambulance, Susan took one last look at the devastation. The open sign lay shattered on the floor, the red letters splintered beyond recognition. The cold morning sun streamed through the bullet-riddled walls, illuminating the absolute ruin of her life. Her diner was gone. Her past was a lie, and her future was a terrifying, wide-open blank. She had survived the night, but as she stepped out into the bright, cold, indifferent dawn, surrounded by the flashing lights of a dozen emergency vehicles, Susan knew with a chilling certainty that the real storm was just beginning.